All right.
All right. So, obviously, you're a very important man in Homeland Security and emergency preparedness. Just for the audience, would you like to explain what your background is in Homeland Security and emergency preparedness?
I'm retired from the Michigan State Police and retired in 2002 as an inspector, and I was the assistant division commander of the Emergency Management Division, which in our system in this state meant that I also served as the assistant director of Emergency Management Homeland Security for Michigan. The Homeland Security part came up after September 11th, not talked about prior to that. And since that time, I've been at Michigan State University in the School of Criminal Justice doing research and teaching on Homeland Security. So I've never had a position in the federal government and so forth, but just I'm an observer of this topic or this issue.
All right. So, given your background, are you aware of a training facility out in New Mexico that teaches law enforcement to manage explosive events?
Yes, and if I'm not mistaken, that may be one of the facilities. I've not been there myself. I wanted to get there but never had an opportunity but before I retired. But that it may be part of the National Domestic Preparedness Consortium, which is a system of universities and other institutions that are funded by the Department of Homeland Security for training. And I think that New Mexico facility is, and I'm pretty sure that the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives uses that facility extensively, since investigating cases of involving explosives is a very important part of that agency's mission, even though they are not part of the Department of Homeland Security. They're in the Department of Justice, but they have a role. But I know first responders and investigators from law enforcement, fire personnel, and others get training out there where they actually do demonstrate, and they may even get to actually set explosives off, if I'm not mistaken.
All right. So if you were actually a trainer at that facility, given your administrative background in emergency management, what would you have to say to those law enforcement personnel? Just bits of advice or anything that you can
Well,
share?
if I was a trainer, I would, besides the technical issues of being able to recognize and take the right actions for dealing with these explosives, there would be decisions to make about who to call first, whether to arrange for an evacuation and closing businesses or evacuating residences or office buildings, whatever it might be, in the vicinity of the potential device, and to get a bomb squad in, or if it was a military type of explosive, and obviously so, like a hand grenade, let's say, or an artillery shell, which I believe are frequently converted into IEDs, improvised explosive devices, and have been in Iraq and Afghanistan. Then you might need assistance from military ordnance people, and I'm sure that has evolved. But back in my day in the state police, it was very clear that anything that looked like it was a military explosive would be something you should call military ordnance or bomb disposal teams, whereas other things that today we might call an IED should be the purview of the police bomb squad. So that would be one issue, is how to, the technical issues of recognizing, and then what action to take, who would have the best response, or who would be the appropriate response, and considering the issue of a potential dirty bomb, the threat that either radioactive material or potentially a chemical or biological agents could be connected to the device, or could be in the vicinity, that they're deliberately attempting to detonate that explosive so as to cause a release. I would also caution them, lessons learned about secondary devices, another explosive device, such as has happened in the United States with the anti-abortion extremists, where they set off one explosion knowing that it would be like honey drawing bees. It would draw in first responders, and then a secondary device whether set to detonate after a certain period of time or by somebody watching remotely and then triggers it to try to kill or injure first responders is a huge concern that they need to think of as well. They also have to be thinking of the fact that even if this is regarded as a terrorist attack or an attempted attack, it's also a potential crime scene. So there's also going to be issues of protecting the crime scene and collecting evidence. Hopefully, if the device is neutralized and so that it doesn't detonate or cause any damage or injuries, and then investigation there. Or if, for whatever reason, the device did detonate, that there would still have to be a crime scene search afterwards to try to find remnants of it to determine what the explosive was and which could lead to who had planted it there.
All right. So you pretty much just touched on that a little bit, but given that an IED actually does go off within the first 24 hours, could you give just a quick synopsis of what the typical law enforcement officer would be doing and what the typical, say, emergency management division officer would actually be doing high up?
Well, the first responders officers, the uniformed officers on the street who get the original 911 call or have a citizen flag them down and alert them to something, or by whatever means they become aware of it, would probably approach to some level where they could kind of see what the issue was, but without wanting to go right up and step on it or touch it or anything like that. And then probably their first reaction would be to secure the scene and of course call for the kind of technical assistance that they're going to need, additional personnel, but also probably the bomb squad, whether military or civilian, and probably fire department, EMS to stand by, and other people to help. And what they would do is they would gradually establish a perimeter where no one else is allowed inside. They would probably also be involved simultaneously with evacuation of people from within the vicinity of the device. And of course, if there was any thought that this was a tremendously powerful bomb God forbid, something like an improvised nuclear device, then I don't know how far you would have to evacuate, but it would be a bit more of an urgent reaction there. But so they would be evacuating and establishing a perimeter to prevent others from coming into the scene. That's right. And they would probably then arrange for things like trying to get utility companies to shut off gas and water and electric service into that area if this was going to be sometime in the event that it detonated, because that could create fires with natural gas or something. More
unwanted problems than needed.
That's right. And there might be a search for secondary devices. They would be certainly contacting the FBI and probably the ATF, or BATFE as it's formally known now. The FBI would be the lead for any terrorism cases, but certainly the expertise of what we traditionally call the ATF would possibly come to bear. There would be, setting up an incident command system. There would be an incident command post probably established some distance away from the device at an appropriate area, where they would also, go through the standard ICS process of where other responders would be staged, setting up the sections of incident command. That may start with a uniformed patrol officer, deputy, or trooper to begin with, and then a supervisor, command level officer would come. There would probably be notification then of the emergency operations center, and it depends on whose jurisdiction this occurs in. In a municipal area or a county, they might first be activating their local municipal or county emergency operations center, or a place like a campus. It could be the command center for Michigan State University. And I'm sure that there would also be coordination with state emergency management / Homeland Security. And in Michigan, that's in the Michigan State Police. It's organized together. But in other states, if this were to occur, those might be separate agencies. Homeland Security may be separate from the State Emergency Management Agency. Certainly, when the feds get involved, the FBI, whatever the closest division or resident agency office is, to respond. There would also be coordination with FEMA, who may activate or partially activate their regional coordination center if it was a significant, for a smaller scale conventional explosive, something like a small pipe bomb, which are
they're
very
not going to
common.
activate all
They're
the
not
systems.
going to be there. FBI may get involved, or ATF, because again, you don't know if this was a politically motivated or crime that might fall under the definition of terrorism, and they're probably going to assume it is until proven otherwise. But so anyway, all those things are going on in that first 24 hours. There has to be a public information, because to the extent that if you've evacuated people or you're preventing people from entering that area, word gets out instantly in this day and age of cell phones and Twitter and social media, and so it's going to be out there, and you want to be ahead of that curve and doing risk or crisis communications to the public without giving away. You're going to be balancing, not trying to give away facts that or information or details that may tip off the bad guys of what you know. So you need to alert the public to the threat and why we have this massive public safety response here, and yet not jeopardize the potential prosecution of people down the road. So, which can be quite an interesting balancing act. So,
all right. So, given these type of attacks and what type of threat they actually invoke on the country as is, what are some current planning techniques or intelligence techniques that are in use right now to actually intercept these IED groups or suicide bomber groups?
Well, and I don't have any so-called insider information, but from what I've read or studied, I'm certain that several things are ongoing. First of all, the FBI and Joint Terrorism Task Forces, JTTFs, and intelligence fusion centers at the state and local level all work together to, I'm sure sometimes a tactic would be to infiltrate a group that they suspect may be inclined in that direction. Some domestic group, let's say it's an anti-government militia, for example, or to at least gather actionable intelligence on these groups. They would try to give a awareness level training to first responders, and it also falls on that see something, say something campaign from the Department of Homeland Security to empower and make aware average citizens who may spot something. For example, I believe the Times Square bomber who tried to set off the car bomb in New York City, it was spotted by, I don't know if it was a taxi driver or some other citizen or a police officer on the street, but it was not anybody from the FBI or Department of Homeland Security. And so to be able to get tips that would come in and to get intelligence, the information that come in and could be analyzed and converted into intelligence. So I'm sure all of that is going on. There are the trainings such as at the facility that you mentioned in New Mexico, and possibly others were training in how to respond to and these things. There's been a kind of a ramping up in the training and equipping of bomb squads around the country, I'm sure. In some cases, there may be a municipal police bomb squad or state police bomb squads in other states, and it probably also could involve hazardous materials response teams, especially if the device was connected in some way to a chemical or biological agent. There's a lot of working with the National Guard civil support teams, the weapons of mass destruction civil support teams, who have tremendous training and equipment capabilities to go into a hot zone and assess the situation, especially if it's suspected that it's more than just that
biological
device,
radiation,
radioactive or anything like that. They can kind of, if nothing else, rule out that there may not be radioactive, where the street level police officer probably doesn't have the kind of technology and equipment, the detection equipment, to determine that with any certainty right up front. I'm sure that there's planning that goes on in local and state emergency management for how to prepare for and respond to events of that type, and certainly there are people in law enforcement that get specialized training in investigations of those cases, FBI and ATF agents, but also some state, local, or county law enforcement to assist them. So, it's a combination of equipment or technology applications, planning, training, and, exercises, drills, or practice to respond to those things. Coordination of a variety of agencies who have either jurisdiction or capabilities that can be brought to bear appropriately to assist with that situation. It could involve coordination with volunteer organizations to assist with, for example, maybe establishing a perimeter. They might be able to use help from, let's say, a community emergency response team, a CERT team, of volunteers who have some basic, very basic level training, not in dealing with IEDs in particular,
like triage, sorting stuff
triage
out, getting ready
and
for.
That's right, and they're identified and they're wearing a helmet or hat and a vest, and they're under the supervision of law enforcement or the fire department, and can be used as manpower to free up other more highly trained officers that have other tasks, but they can help establish that perimeter, blocking off roads and sidewalks and alleys and so forth like that. So there's that coordination as well. So there's really potentially a lot of things going on, whether this is just a pipe bomb or something much more sinister and hazardous.
So obviously this is very complex with all the planning and stuff like that. You also mentioned the See Something, Say Something campaign.
Yes.
So obviously that's what you would recommend to make sure citizens are aware of what's going on. If you see something that's out of place, obviously say something about it. But what we're wondering is, how are emergency management and law enforcement planning on combating civilian fears after an attack like this actually does happen?
Well, a big part of that, I think, is in the public information or the crisis communications that I was mentioning earlier, and that is the challenge is always to give timely, accurate information and to give sufficient information that people can actually take appropriate actions, whether that be to shelter in place, evacuate, whatever it might be. And at the same time balancing the law enforcement interests of protecting some details that are necessary to be able to protect their investigation and eventual criminal prosecution and not allow the bad guys to escape or take some sort of other defensive action to thwart their response. So, but again, public health and safety is a paramount value to protect. So, I could imagine for example, a joint information center being established, or press releases and interviews being done that involve law enforcement and emergency management and possibly other officials, chief elected officials, whether that be a mayor or a county commissioner or the governor, or depending on the location and nature of the incident. All those things to calm the public and give them, this is what we can tell you that we have, and this is what we recommend, some specific guidelines of actions that you can do. This is what to be aware of. They can really emphasize that, See Something, Say Something, but what do they need to do to protect themselves, their families, their children, neighbors and neighborhoods, their communities.
All right. Also, another thing that we've been seeing online, either citizens or even law enforcement, they've been saying for planning-wise to actually intercept these groups, is one thing they suggest is actually coming up with a government list where if you go and buy out certain things that say Home Depot and they all match together or bomb-making materials, what you'd be put on a government list and watched thereafter. Do you think a system like this would actually be effective, and is there even enough manpower to even do a system like this?
Well, certainly there's any time where going to compile a list or create a database, let's say, one always has to be concerned about privacy expectations and intruding on civil liberties that may be protected by constitutional amendments, for example. I am certain that there are certain in illegal narcotics, they would call them precursors, but materials that could be reasonably expected to be used for creating bombs. Let's say the fertilizer bomb that was used in Oklahoma City in 1995. If all of a sudden there was the disappearance or theft of a large amount of this nitrogen-based fertilizer, there's been a lot of awareness to the farmers or to the elevators and chemical companies that store this kind of stuff,
like Dow Chemical
or whomever, that would report it to authorities and to investigate that. And now, certainly, if they then get intelligence in the investigation, that this person may also have some connection with a extremist domestic group, that's going to get into into the intelligence process, and whether that involves surveillance or just that they're going to get a hit on that name, a caution if a police officer stops them for speeding or something like that. I'm sure there are other materials like that if it's bought, if a certain number of materials are combined, or the quantity of materials, even one of the ingredients, if you were, was bought in a certain quantity, they would want to check out, is there a legitimate reason for it? There'd be some trigger in the system. And so again, it probably doesn't get in the investigation, and maybe you have a suspect and a name is taken down, somebody, they talk to them, and at this point they seem innocuous. Well, I'm certain that's in the report file, and it may be something that a name would come up in further investigation at whether through the Intelligence Fusion Center or just that law enforcement agency. I don't know that there's a watch list or a national domestic terrorist list of that sort. I'm sure that there are a number of people that have been identified as potential suspects in various plots and so forth, that the authorities have their names, and but again, anytime you talk about creating some like national database or list,
gotta be worried about
one has to be very concerned that we're not pushing the envelope in terms of
so that's the fine line between something like the Patriot Act or something that would actually make that fall under terrorism or not terrorism. So it's kind of that gray area.
Sure. There's that's right. There's different authorities, or the American public and our court system would probably tolerate and accept, understand, whatever verb you would apply, a greater deal of government intrusiveness in a case involving suspected terrorism. And then you get into debates sometimes over what is a terrorist group. It gets back to the definition of terrorism. There's not a single definition that's a consensus among different government agencies or scholars and so forth. Certainly within the United States, a good guide is the Department of Justice definition and the definition that the FBI would apply. But I also know from my experience in doing training around the country that there are some people, for example, that don't believe that the Earth Liberation Front or Animal Liberation Front should ever be classified as terrorists. They're just very noble people with a worthwhile ideology, and so they may burn a building now and then, and or let some animals go from a research facility, but as long as they don't kill anybody, they shouldn't be called terrorists. And yet, these are groups that I'm sure law enforcement watches because of what they do, and that there are those that would argue, the government would argue, that they do fall under the definition of what comprises terrorist groups or activities. So, but you get those kind of debates, and so you have to be sensitive to that there's not consensus, and if it turns out that this is just a prankster doing a pipe bomb who doesn't even realize the potential damage and injury that can be caused by a simple pipe bomb, they're really not motivated for any political or religious or social reason or anything like that, then you kind of ramp down and address it as a so-called routine or normal crime, if you will, as opposed to terrorism. But quite often you have to, give it the benefit of the doubt that this may be terrorism until we prove otherwise.
So, involving IEDs, are you aware of some tests that agencies can run on IEDs, like latent fingerprints, lifting fingerprints after an explosion, or markings that can signify where they got this material
I'm sure
from?
that all of those are true, and again, it becomes more complicated if the device detonates. But if it is neutralized without being detonated, I am certain that they can, in some cases, get latent prints, and I'm not a forensic science expert by any stretch, but that they may be able to trace chemicals, so let's say, or the ingredients that were used in, if it's some sort of a bomb that involves, let's say, gunpowder, black powder, or fertilizer, or fuel oil, or other combustible liquids, whatever it might be. They'd be able to track down the sources, where it came from, who purchased it or acquired it, whether it was taken in a theft. I'm sure that there may be other trace evidence that, I suppose if a person is perspiring, there might be DNA evidence from perspiration, or from skin cells that might have been deposited during the manufacture, the placement of an IED. But certainly there's not going to be latent prints or trace evidence or DNA at every kind of a crime scene. And again, if it detonates, that can,
complicate things,
obliterate things, especially if there's some fire involved. But there's no doubt that there are things. I mean, when you look at the cases where bombs have been detonated, and forensic scientists and bomb experts were able to determine what kind of a device it was, they might find just a little trigger device, just a little scrap, a remnant from that. And if you have the whole device undetonated, it makes it much not easy, but easier, or it gives you more to work with to try to find the maker. Because there may be patterns. There may be a certain group or individual who is known to make a certain type of device, to use a certain type of timer,
type of switch.
That's right. A switch, whatever it might be, to or a certain method using cell phones, to trigger the device remotely. There's a great amount, I'm sure, that's been learned from the military experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan. And fortunately, we haven't had anything of that scale or nature here in the United States, but that's always the possibility. It could be a car bomb. The IED could be in the trunk of a car, or in a vehicle. It could end up being a suicide bomber sort of a thing, which we haven't had yet, fortunately. So.
And just touching off of that, just to wrap it up, some people say, even with all the planning that we have today, that they feel really confident that these type of attacks will never happen in the country. But we have top law enforcement officials saying that they do believe it's going to happen within our generation. Do you believe that this can actually happen within our generation?
Absolutely. I think those are very real possibilities, because they're very difficult to prevent, and because the materials are so easily available, the technology is so easily available, in contrast with an improvised nuclear device. That's a great concern or threat, but probably much less likely because of all the practical limitations than a simple suicide bomber or IED being used by domestic terrorists. And you see the prevalence of it in other countries, some of which have rather robust security measures in place, where they're not as concerned about civil liberties and privacy expectations, and yet it still happens, and they're much more homogeneous.